episode of EmpireApps.show. Thank you for joining me. I'm the host, Leo Dion. This is the BrightDigit podcast where I talk about Swift development in the Apple ecosystem, and just overall updates, changes, and ways that managers, CTOs, and developers can stay current and up to date with new things coming out when it comes to Swift and Apple products. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about SwiftUI, the good, the bad, and the benefits. Specifically, I want to talk about my experience and examples of work that I've been doing in SwiftUI over the last few months. And then we'll be getting into why SwiftUI is here and why Apple introduced it in 2019. We'll then be talking about why SwiftUI is not really a good use case in a lot of examples. I'll be talking about some workarounds about how to get around that if you still want to use SwiftUI. And then we'll get into why, when, and where SwiftUI is the ideal use and what apps or maybe devices where SwiftUI really makes a lot of sense. So I want to talk a little bit about my experience and examples of where I've been using SwiftUI. So back in June, I actually did a workshop, and while it was the same month as WWDC, a couple of weeks actually afterwards, I ended up using UIKit for it. This is called, I called it Peopart because that's the random name generator, what it came up with. Essentially, it's a list of blog posts and comments that you can see on an iOS app. I used UIKit for this example because at the time I really didn't want to jump into SwiftUI with new developers and risk that. But I will say that with this application, I am slowly migrating over to SwiftUI. So the sample app is actually available for you on GitHub, and I will share a link for folks later in the show notes. But this is an example that I want to see what it'll do and what it will take to convert a UIKit app over to SwiftUI and see what exactly happens when I do that. The other example is an app that I'm using or I'm building for my local coding community, LansingCodes, where people in Lansing can see what events and what meetups are taking place. It uses the Firebase backend and web API that Eric, my colleague, had built for the local community, and uses Combine, obviously, along with Firebase. It uses SwiftUI, and I think it's a really great example of where I'm taking a fairly simple app, basically new app, and building it into an iPhone app in this case. Lastly, you probably heard I've been working on an app called HeartTwitch, an independent watch app that uses SwiftUI and Vapor as the backend. And the idea of this app is that live streamers can share their heart rate right from their Apple Watch and then share it into a web browser window, then use something like OBS for live streaming to share that video. This is a great example of using SwiftUI. It's a brand new app. It's Apple Watch. It makes a lot of sense because we're talking about streaming data. And so this is one example where I think that SwiftUI works out really well, and that is the Apple Watch. So you're probably wondering, why is SwiftUI now? And I think there's a few good reasons. We did an episode back in June with René Cacheaux and Josh Berlin from Ray Wunderlich to talk about iOS app architecture. And Ray had some really strong opinions about the issues with storyboards, specifically this idea of single source of truth. What are your recommendations? Or your personal styling?
I would not recommend anyone use Interface Builder, especially on large teams.
Yes.
That's one of the strong opinions that I do have. It's mostly because with Interface Builder, you don't have a source of truth. Everything that you put in your storyboard or your nib file is subject to change by the code underneath it. And so when you're looking at the storyboard itself and you're kind of tweaking the layouts and you're tweaking the constraints and stuff like that, there's nothing stopping the code underneath for completely changing that. And so when there's bugs and stuff, sometimes it's really hard to figure out the root cause because you can't just look at the storyboard. That's not enough.
He said the problem with storyboards as well with coded applications, if you're doing two of the same thing, then you run into the issue where your UI is not going to look like what you expect it to look like when you build the storyboard in Interface Builder as opposed to coded. And this can run into issues because you don't have a quote-unquote single source of truth for how your user interface is going to work out. What is exactly single source of truth? What Wikipedia says is it's the practice of structuring information models and associated data schema such that every data element is mastered or edited in one place. In other words, you have one central location where data is, and as data is added or entered or edited, the view automatically updates that accordingly. And what this comes down to is what's called reactive programming or functional reactive programming. We talked a little bit about this with Jason in our SwiftUI episode. Jason has a lot of years of experience building a user interface and reactive programming. Reactive frameworks have been around even back when Objective-C was the only way to develop an app. And Jason talked about this and how reactive programming is supposed to work.
And so we all sat down, we looked at it, and we started incorporating that into the work that we're doing. It was particularly nice because a lot of the apps we were developing at the time were very heavy with network updates, a lot of JSON API requests that were dependent upon each other. So, you would set up maybe an operation queue that you would have to have something before you get to the next and try to create these dependencies. But, that code can become a little bit difficult to manage long term. But then when he started showing me how these streams, as they're called on the reactive Cocoa world, basically streams of data that you can subscribe to, you can observe this object, you can subscribe to the data that's coming across, and you can manipulate on the fly to get it to what you need. And as those data pieces are coming across, you can filter them based on specific criteria. You can map them into other objects. You can trigger new network calls based on the results. It became very easy to tie in a lot of that dependency logic into a single network call, where before we would have, delegates and operation queues and things just strung out throughout the app. Now we have one simple chained function that has that logic kept in one place. So it was kind of nice to keep that all together there. So it was much easier to maintain.
There's some really interesting examples in places where reactive programming has already been used. We see this when it comes to a lot of the JavaScript libraries out there. I think Angular kind of does a reactive thing. Even React.js does a bit. And Vue.js, they all kind of have this idea of having a central place where data is stored and used and reacted to in kind of like a two-way binding sort of way. I had some experience with this actually when I used to do Silverlight development. Yes, how many of you remember Silverlight? The idea is we're shifting away from Apple's suggested pattern of model view controller, where you have a central controller that listens to model changes and updates the view. And now what we have is a model view view model example, or view model view model pattern. The idea being is that there is a view model which is a conversion of that model into a data model that the view will use in order to show what is going on. For instance, like you might have a list of people, but that list of people is not just going to have that data object for people, but it might also have some other metadata that you want to display on the screen, or a view model which will say things like what color to show or what font to say, and things like this will be stored in a view model so that the view can update it accordingly. Some of the components that are used in reactive programming have been translated over to Combine in SwiftUI, and there's some specific terminology that's been used. For instance, we have the idea of a publisher. So one example is where you're downloading data from a URL. You'll have a publisher that will have that data or error based on how the status of that network request went. And then you might use functional programming to then map that data and using a JSON decoder to a set of people instances or blog content. And then you also have the ability to take errors and be able to map those into, say, an empty list of people, because in some cases you may not want to show an error. You may just want to show an empty list. So that's the idea of a publisher. It's a stream of events that you then are using functional programming can map to specific data or data instances. We also have the idea of a subscriber. A subscriber is something that listens in to a publisher and updates accordingly. So when it comes to like functional programming, a lot of your functions are kind of subscribers in a way. The most common subscriber that we see, especially with SwiftUI, are the idea of observable objects. So for instance, you create a class, which is your view model, which listens into updates of models based on data from a URL. The object model does whatever mapping needs to take place, and then updates the view model accordingly. We also have like an environment object, states, bindable objects, things like this, depending on how you want that data used throughout the view hierarchy. But the essential idea is like this observable or observed object that's then used within SwiftUI. I think the biggest benefit, what we'll see with SwiftUI, is we can finally say goodbye to storyboards. I think storyboards have gotten as far as they can get, essentially. And the biggest problem with storyboards is that you're constantly dealing with a really complex set of user interfaces. And I think it also introduced, instead of using a UI to build your user interface, we can finally have what's called declarative programming brought into Swift. So before if you do a coded UI, for instance, you're doing a lot of imperative programming and creating that user interface. Here we're using declarative programming, where we can do things that we've commonly seen when it comes to HTML. So instead of saying print out paragraph, print this out in this font, animate this thing accordingly, we're using declarative programming as a way to basically have almost WYSIWYG, almost declarative way of seeing how a UI is structured using code. So you just put in a paragraph within a div. You don't have to say print paragraph begin, print paragraph end, things like this. It's all looks according to how your code looks. Another issue that we see with storyboards is when we're doing development within teams. So Alex had a really great point about how storyboards kind of have their own limitations.
There are trade-offs for one approach and another, and at some point it breaks down, right? Or in some cases it doesn't make sense. And specifically, I'm talking about, let's say, storyboards don't break down on scale when you have, I don't know, more than 20 people, let's say, working on the app.
Yep.
But then it doesn't make sense to do it right away as you're a 1 or 2 people team.
Yes. But when it comes to working with teams, I think we see the biggest issue when we're merging different storyboards together, or multiple people are working on a single storyboard. As I often suggest, if you're going to do storyboards, make them as small as possible and use storyboard references. But in the end, like, working on a team and working with storyboards can be a real challenge. The other benefit that we see with SwiftUI is that Apple now has a way to build quote-unquote cross-platform applications, that is, cross-platform within Apple's ecosystem using SwiftUI. I don't know how many of you remember Catalyst, but we talked about this in our episode with Daniel Jalkut, where we talked about Mac development and how Catalyst kind of ran into certain limitations.
You know, it's funny, I had another snap reaction to that during the keynote, and it was basically, I think I tweeted something like, Apple has announced and deprecated a technology all in the space of one keynote, which was basically like, hey, there's this brand new exciting technology we have that you can adapt your iOS apps to the Mac, and you should not use it. You should use this new SwiftUI. And that's not what they said literally, but...
So can you do a Mac app with SwiftUI, but not necessarily Catalyst?
Absolutely, yeah. SwiftUI is a native technology and that's just to clarify, that's the big promise of SwiftUI, is that it is a native technology on all Apple platforms.
Okay, yeah.
So it's kind of funny. It means that there are 2 ways to write a Mac app with SwiftUI.
Right. Because you could go the Project Catalyst route and have basically one bundle, essentially, that will work on both iOS and Mac OS, or you can just do a native Mac app and still use SwiftUI.
Right, or more precisely, do a native SwiftUI app and have it run on the Mac, on iOS, the watch, or the TV.
Right. But now, SwiftUI allows us a truly cross-platform way to build a Mac app, a watch app, and iPhone or iPad app or tvOS app as well. And this goes back to our stuff about HTML. Now we have kind of these this way of using almost like media queries to be able to specify how certain OSs will look in certain ways using preprocessor directives or things like that as well. So why might you not want to use SwiftUI? I think if you're using an app that's fairly old and it still supports older operating systems, I think you're probably better off sticking with UIKit or whatever framework you're using. There's just no need and no desire to move things to SwiftUI because there's nothing that the user will really see when it comes to that. So in that case, I think that you probably can stick with UIKit, and if your audience tends to use older devices or uses older operating systems, there's no need to move to SwiftUI. There's no benefit to the user in that case. Another problem we see is the lack of documentation. I think this has been a really big challenge. There's a great website that provides kind of some information about some of the issues with lack of documentation when it comes to Apple stuff. I think that can be a real challenge with something that's only been around for 6 months to a year. You may also require UIKit in a lot of ways. First of all, you might have like a third-party dependency to UIKit. You're using some CocoaPod that has some UI widget that uses UIKit. In that case, it can be a real uphill battle trying to use SwiftUI in that case. There's also UI widgets that are just simply missing from SwiftUI that we have in UIKit. One of the biggest ones I can think of is UI collection view. Especially with some of the updates we have, data sources and diffable data, it makes a lot of sense to stick with UI collection in a lot of ways because of all the features that it gives us with UIKit and a lot of robust stuff that they've added over the last few years. It makes sense to just go with UI collection and not try to like hack something together necessarily in SwiftUI. So you're probably wondering, well, how do I still use SwiftUI if I have an older application? Because there are workarounds to get around this. There are things like preprocessor directives. You can say that only newer operating systems have access to certain features that are built on SwiftUI. There's also the ability to interface between UIKit and SwiftUI. For example, when you have an application that is UIKit based and you want to bring in something from SwiftUI, we have UIHosting Controller on iOS. Now, UIHosting Controller is the iOS version of that, but there's one for WatchKit as well as AppKit. And that allows you to use a SwiftUI element within UIKit. So that's one great example. The other thing is that let's say you need to bring in something from UIKit to your SwiftUI app. In this case, you want to use something like UIViewRepresentable or UIViewControllerRepresentable, which allows you to do that. I don't know how many times I've used an activity indicator from UIKit in order to show a busy, like for instance, I'm downloading a URL or making a URL request. I'll oftentimes need to make an activity indicator from UIKit and bring that over to SwiftUI. So then the question is when is SwiftUI ideal? What is the use case where SwiftUI makes a lot of sense? I think if your UI is fairly simple, you probably could just stick with using SwiftUI in that case. It makes a lot of sense. And an example of this is like that LansingCodes app that I built. Or for instance, an app that just uses table views. Why not just use a list in SwiftUI? It makes sense and it'll work out great. If you're willing to work within the limitations of SwiftUI, it actually can work with you as opposed to against you. And of course, that makes sense if your device is fairly simple, like an Apple Watch. I think any Apple Watch app, it makes sense to switch over to SwiftUI at some point. SwiftUI was built out of the Apple Watch UI team, so it makes a lot of sense. The other thing is, are you willing to deal with unstable API and docs? If you're willing to deal with that and deal with the challenges and limitations that come up with that, then it's probably okay to just go to SwiftUI. And if you're starting with a new project, any sort of new application, then maybe going with SwiftUI makes a lot of sense. If you're going to start from scratch, you may as well start using SwiftUI, especially if you're thinking about migrating to other operating systems within the Apple ecosystem. And if your audience So let's say people who are really technically inclined, like developers or folks who already are using the latest operating system, then it makes sense to go with SwiftUI in that case. You're willing to deal with whatever issues and be able to deal with the limitations that SwiftUI has. There's a great article by Rambo, which I'll link in the notes, where he talks about how SwiftUI is ready in a lot of cases. And maybe if your audience is the right fit, maybe it's the right time to switch over to using SwiftUI, especially if you're starting a new project or something on the Apple Watch. So we have a lot of great episodes you might want to catch up on, where we talk a little bit more about SwiftUI and some of the new stuff that came out in WWDC. We have our episode in video that I did about SwiftUI and 2020 trends. We also have the episode with Daniel Jalkut on Mac development. We talked about SwiftUI and reactive programming with Jason Anderson, and then Apple Watch development with Gary Sabo. And if you're interested more on app architecture, we have René, Cacheaux, and Josh Berlin from Ray Wunderlich, who talked about iOS app architecture in their great book on learning how to do iOS app architecture the right way. You can learn more and catch up with more articles and episodes on my business website, BrightDigit.com, as well as the podcast website, EmpowerApps.show. Thanks again for joining me. I look forward to talking to you again on our next episodes.